This forecast is complex and does not lend itself to a single simple explanation. It is also fraught with uncertainties, particularly around the federal tax bill and other pending federal actions. For example, if Congress refunds the CHIP program, as they must, the projected deficit for the current 18-19 biennium drops from $188 million to $10 million. This forecast is not saying that the U.S. economy and the Minnesota economy are not expanding, because they are. But rather, they are not expanding quite as much as last February's forecast assumed. Based on that forecast, the legislature and I'm not casting any blame on anyone here, we collectively cut state taxes and increased state spending, particularly in areas like transportation, early childhood, K-12, and higher education, the health insurance rebate, and reinsurance. All of those initiatives combined used up most of the projected surplus. Now, with a new, less optimistic economic forecast, we have slightly exceeded our budgetary limits. That is readily correctable, and I commit to doing so in the next legislative session. I want to emphasize that our state's overall fiscal situation is very solid. We have accumulated budgeted reserve of $1.6 billion, more than enough to support us through any of these economic uncertainties. As our state's 3.3% unemployment rate attests, Minnesota's economy is very strong and continues to grow. So again, my goal in the next legislative session is to make modest corrections in future revenues and expenditures to restore structural budget surpluses, both for this and the next biennium. As I've said before, I intend to wait for next February's budget forecast before I finalize my budget recommendations. Some of the questions surrounding this forecast will be answered during the next 3 months. Next February's forecast should provide us with a more reliable guideline for the fiscal changes the legislature and I will need to work together to make. The need for those modifications underscores the imperative that we reestablish constructive working relationships between the legislative and executive branches before and during that session. We will have our honest disagreements. That is to be expected. However, we all share a responsibility to the people of Minnesota to work together for their best interests. I pledge to do my part to contribute toward that goal. Try to respond to questions. Well, I would agree that the budget reserve is set aside for, serious economic downturns, which this is not. Again, I'm not going to wed myself to any particular budget formulation until I see the February forecast, but I would agree with the budget commissioner exercising proper caution. It's sort of in the water they drink over there. Yeah.
Governor, you're heading into some of your last forecasts here, and this is the first shortfall after 8 surpluses. How do you feel about that news?
Disappointed. It's it was a great sequence of 8 consecutive projected surpluses. But again, this is a projection, and I view it as a need for a relatively minor mid-course correction, but it's also an indicator that we've reached the limit, at least under the current projected national economic growth, to what we can do. And I'm, I was part of wanting to do everything possible in this last legislative session based on the February forecast, and we operated within that framework, and now that framework has changed, it's narrowed a bit. So again, I don't think this should be misunderstood. The fact that this is a projected deficit for this biennium and the next is not because of an economic downturn in Minnesota or nationally. It's relative to the projections that were made in February. And so those projections have been downsized slightly by the National Economic Forecast and by our economic forecast team, and that's what we're dealing with now. But it's not a sign of any kind of systemic problem or certainly not a crisis.
Governor, obviously what's happening in Washington with the GOP tax bill, uncertain, unclear, but as you look at it, there are some very specific proposals that obviously would affect Minnesota both in the short term and the long term. Your thoughts on some of the specific proposals? And
well, I'm waiting for the conference report. I mean, this thing has changed so much, and whether they have amendments handwritten by lobbyists in the margins of the bill, I mean, it's hard to comment. I don't know, for example, what the treatment of capital gains is finally going to be. I don't know what the final treatment of state and local tax deductions is going to be. I don't know what's the SHIP, I guess, is going to be treated separately from that. But that'll have a major bearing on our budget situation. Is it going to provide any kind of economic stimulus? As they predicted, it might, and we'll see what the forecast says in February. That they'll factor that in. If it's there is a slight uptick because of the tax rebates, it's my prediction would be very, very slight. But every 1/10% affects these forecasts by tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. So that's why this one is, I'm not faulting. They did the very best they could, but there's too many unanswered questions, and we'll have better clarity in February.
Governor, you said that you didn't want to blame anyone, but you've spent several months criticizing some of those tax cuts that were enacted. Why the change of tone? Isn't this evidence that they were problematic?
Well, I continue to believe they were excessive. But the real impact is down the road now. The 2021 biennium, which is looking at a larger deficit, is going to be much more of a factor. So, I mean, I think it's a factor. But you can also look at the spending I outlined. Transportation, reinsurance, the health insurance rebate, education. So, I mean, they're a combination of factors. That's why this is a complex statement here, and you can try to isolate, this one piece of it and put the blame on that, I think is not appropriate to the situation. I think it's a combination of factors. And in this instance where you're talking about the impact on 18-19 biennium, even those tax items that I identified aren't what caused or drove this, except as part of a combination.
Governor, you had mentioned that going about as far as we can under the current economic climate you're referring to. Does this mean that some of your initiatives like all-day pre-K and some of those ultimately are going to have to be scaled back?
Well, I'm not going to, again, I'm not making any budget recommendations. I'm a long ways away from thinking that pre-K needs to be scaled back. It may not be able to be expanded as I'd hoped the budget would permit my proposing in the next legislative session, but there's nothing in there now that says to me that would have to be scaled back.
What should the state do to keep the state's economy? What should state government do to keep the state's economy strong? Just in general overall policy.
We need, we have more job vacancies than we have people unemployed. We have people who are underemployed because of lack of skills, but we have more employers out there who want to expand, who can't find the workforce that meets their specifications. So, it is not an immediate fix to that. I mean, but 3.3% unemployment when I was taking economics 101, 4% was considered a full employment economy. And so 3.3%, and as you look at the major economic centers around the state, it's not just the metro. It's regional economic centers throughout greater Minnesota that are also extremely low, sometimes a record low unemployment. So it's really a dearth of people. And most of these businesses need more people in order to expand. And so it's not an immediate solution, but the real solution is to have our higher education system, well, all of our education system, but culminating with higher education tuned into what the employment needs are of especially major employers, in communities around the state. And I think some of that is happening and it just needs to be accelerated.
Are you saying Minnesota needs to attract more residents?
Well, we do attract. We have attracted, and we continue to attract more. And that certainly would be part of it also, But, you've got to attract people who have the skill set that the businesses are looking for, and I think it's more reliable to be talking about training our young people, giving them those skills. I had lunch with my friend Will Seeger yesterday. He's got working in a relationship with Summit Academy. They go up to Ely, and these young people learn skills in the building trades that make them readily employable when they come out. Well, that's the kind of targeted, on a specific employment need that we need to do. And then some of the Minnesota State campuses have really done an exemplary job of making those linkages with local employers, but there's more of it. We need to accelerate it. And when there's a new chancellor there, I certainly will emphasize that priority.
In the past 4 years, there have been extreme budget surpluses, but also some pretty fast-growing government spending. Would you say that?
Well, again, the classic charge then is, well, we're spending, healthcare costs went relative to the forecast have gone down. We increased spending, but you look at the areas where we increased: transportation, reinsurance, the health premium rebate, education. I mean, I think those were pretty broad. I can't speak for others, but from my view, were broadly bipartisan supported. So to say, well, increase, I'm sure somebody's going to, anybody who tries to put the blame on this one or that one is cherry picking. Increased expenditures are part of the equation. Again, I think the increased expenditures in the last session, in the context of the budgeted forecast, was prudent use of resources for those purposes I just described. And now we'll have to prune that back depending on the February forecast. But I think we've operated responsibly. The cost of government, one of those long overlooked measures, which was ballyhooed at the beginning as being the definitive word, but now it makes state look good. Nobody wants to look at it. We're not spending excessively. We're increasing spending on education, things that I think are vitally important. On the reinsurance and the health rebates were very expensive and are not continuing commitments at this point. So, I think we've been fiscally responsible, and most objective outside observers will credit us for such. And if we can't spend more because of an increasing amount of revenue, we can adjust accordingly.
Since you say there are so many questions, are 4 budget forecasts per biennium too many?
I'll let them answer that. I don't. I can't say. I haven't thought of that question. I can't give you an answer.
How good is this forecast today?
Well, this one is a barometer, but again, the way it's set up now, and especially with the legislature not coming back until the end of February, it's really it's not the final word that will be used to guide that spending. Now, look at the last February forecast and look at how things have changed since then. So there's no forecast that over the passage of time is going to be definitive or be absolutely correct. The question is what's the most definitive word you can have while you're making these decisions, and then you come back and make these mid-course adjustments, which is what we'll have to do next session. But I can't think. The end of the session analysis, which doesn't get much credit or much attention, I think is almost in itself a forecast, a definitive statement, taking the February economic assumptions and saying, okay, what happened in this last session? Where do we stand today? And I find that to be more informative than, say, going back to February before all these actions took place. Go ahead.
Every budget year, we use this forecast for you as a governor to put your budget together for January. So that's one of the reasons.
Yeah, but I'm not putting my budget together for January. But you're right. For the next administration, for the next budget year, 2019, they need a forecast in end of November. So, yeah.
Governor,
how much work is going to be required to restore the relationships to make these modest corrections that will need to be?
Well, I'm ready and willing, and it's a process. But we all have a responsibility. The people of Minnesota, we're all elected, serve the best interests of the state, and I don't carry things around. If I carried things around, I'd be 10 feet under just by the weight of everything. I can work with anybody who will work with me, and I'll extend the olive branches and do everything I can to be constructive and positive. We're going to have honest disagreements. There's no doubt about that, and they're going to be highly charged in an election year. So I'm not saying it's all going to be sweetness and light, but ultimately, if we fail to reestablish constructive professional relationships, we fail the people of Minnesota, and they'll be the judge of that, and should be.
Everyone good?
All right, thank you.